Okay, for the part four of this week's topic on class, I'm just going to very briefly look at some aspects of how class is thought about in today's society in contemporary terms. I've done a whole lot of research around the way the representations of Bogan in Australia represent and kind of stand in for talking about class symbolically without really like mentioning class itself. And I've also done this with the figure of the hipster as well. So if you're interested in that, it's in the book Youth, Class and Everyday Struggles. Specifically for the Bogan, this is a term that typically refers to someone who does not conform to the tastes and leisure practices of middle class people, i.e. the working class, but it's not really just a complete standing for working class people. It's normally more kind of what's deemed to be vulgar or uncouth kind of consumption. What's interesting about the Bogan in particular is the rise of what's kind of another figure is the cashed up Bogan, and particularly around mining workers and fly in, fly out workers that earn a lot of money and therefore have some disposable income to spend on luxury items. There's a link there to I think it's a current affair or Today Tonight, I can't remember which one, a story about the cashed up Bogan, and it's a really, I think, good example of the way the class is kind of talked about in society, but through these figures without actually talking about some of the wider systematic issues. In that story, there's a whole bunch of different class tropes and class relations, and it's done through the kind of moral panicky lens that those shows tend to purvey, and we've spoken about how moral panics work in previous weeks. So the cashed up Bogan kind of represents this kind of middle class fear in a way that I've done all this study and I'm doing this professional job and still I don't feel like I'm comfortable and I'm struggling to pay off the mortgage, and look at these vulgar Bogans, having a good time, and, it's not fair. So again, this is, I think, a kind of microcosm of wider class relations in Australia. Class needs also to be thought of in terms of the way that it intersects with things like gender, race, ethnicity, geographical location, disability, all these different kinds of other contours of inequality. In particular, there's some really interesting and important work done in the UK mostly around the intersections between class and gender, particularly around the ways that young working class women are represented in the media, particularly through fashion shows like, what not to wear, around parenting styles and, in house renovation shows and stuff like that as well. More structurally, class has generally been kind of thought about, and even in the kind of, Marx and Weber and Bourdieu versions of it in many ways, through the family, like as if each member in the family is of the same kind of class or economic situation. And I think the critique of this is that it kind of renders women invisible in that system. It assumes that their class position is equivalent to the male spouse, and particularly the patriarchal family has been the model of the family. It's largely used as the model of the way that inequality has been measured. And again, this renders the position of women, if not invisible, kind of obscured by other structural constraints. Particularly around the fact that women are still largely doing most of the housework and child rearing, that they tend to have less superannuation. So particularly when women go through divorce, their class position in terms of economics can very quickly plummet down the hierarchy. And so gender, in this sense, if we think about it broadly, complicates these kind of broader pictures of inequality of class, particularly related to money, but also with kind of notions of cultural capital as well. In historical terms, the kind of patriarchal family kind of model may have worked to measure class a little bit more accurately, decades ago, but now that more and more women are in paid employment, now there's more diverse family structures. Again, this kind of complicates the patterns of how inequality is measured through the household. The other thing that we'll look at in some detail in the weeks when we look at gender is the difficulty of accounting for what work it means. So we tend to think about work as something that you leave the house for and go and get paid by a company or whatever. But as much feminist critique has shown is that things like housework, child rearing, unpaid labour, but really the whole capitalist system relies on that being free and being kind of largely located in the responsibility of women for things to function. So this is what's often referred to as the patriarchal dividend. So again, class, gender, race, ethnicity, these things complicate the picture of inequality, and we'll talk about gender and sexuality, class and ethnicity in some more detail in future weeks. There's been some debates over the past couple of decades too about whether class is a bit of an outdated concept, particularly around the idea that that subsistence wage thing didn't really happen, which I think is debatable, and we may be returning to that. But more along the kind of lines that we kind of think of ourselves in terms of our own identity, as much through our consumer practices as our kind of production practices. That is, many people consider their self-identity more bound up with the things they do in their leisure times and the stuff they consume, rather than the job that they do. And for some critics, this kind of challenges the idea whether there can be such a thing as a class consciousness. And certainly there's been a decline in class-related politics. It seems as though many people now vote even against their own economic interests, and vote a lot around kind of other issues as well. That's if generally people even see that there's a choice in terms of who they're voting for, in terms of what the two parties represent. So there's debates here where there's been a decline in class consciousness, or if there's ever been any. The way the politics now works doesn't seem to be about economics as much. And also, in terms of what's been referred to as the embourgeoisement of the working class, where people that had previously maybe been defined as working class seek to kind of define themselves outside of those relations. What's interesting about that is when surveys are done about what class people think they are, disproportionately people put themselves in the middle class bracket, even though they're kind of economically or culturally probably more objectively in the working class bracket. So there's an identity kind of shift here going on. This is all happening in around a period where inequality is increasing more than ever before, where less and less people own more and more stuff and own more and more of the wealth. So one of the essays in the course is about this, and these are the kind of things we'd like you to have a look at. And again, if you want to reflect a little bit about your own position, there's a link there to click on to kind of get a bit of an idea about where you sit in the class system, or if your family, if you want to put in a kind of household figure there, and it'll show you where you are in the kind of global wealth. Because importantly, as I'm going to talk about a bit in the next slide, class has generally been seen as a thing that's been measured and analysed within nation states. But increasingly, in a globalised world, we have to think about the relations of class between nation states and between regions and things like that. So I'm only very briefly going to touch on these sociologists, but there's, in the last 20 or 30 years, as globalisation has kind of taken hold of the sociological imagination more and more, many really prominent sociologists start thinking about class across the globe rather than within countries. So Manuel Castells, for instance, rather than the bourgeoisie and the working class, points that maybe we need to think about the global class system as the networkers, the networked, and the switched off. The networkers are the kind of mostly white global elite that have access to all the technology and are allowed to move around the world and travel. The networked are those kind of doing the service work, serving the coffee, doing moving from country to country to serve those people, but largely left out of the monetary gains of that position. And the switched off is, when Castells was writing this, was like half the world that had never made a phone call at that stage. So again, this is a kind of shift from thinking about the systematic way that inequality reproduces from within countries to maybe thinking about how the rich in the Western world, for instance, regardless of what country they are in, probably have more in common with each other than the disadvantaged in their own countries as well. Bauman talks about these very metaphorically as the tourist and vagabond. Again, the tourist is the kind of global elite that can move around the world freely. The vagabond are those that are left to deal with the consequences of globalization that is kind of spits them out or exploits them. He sees that particularly around the production processes of producing our mobile phones and coffee and all this kind of stuff, the wasted lives of people that are kind of killed and died or put into forms of slavery to serve those kind of forms of exploitation. And he also refers to these groups as what he calls collateral casualties of consumerism, where Western consumerism and consumer goods are largely produced and based on the exploitation of people in the so-called developing world. John Urry started to think about how Bourdieu's ideas of cultural capital need to start to think a little bit about these new relationships, about how people can move or not, and whether people have access to these kind of digital networks. And he talked a little bit about what he called network capital. I spoke at length in earlier weeks about Ulrich Beck's idea. He argues that we're moving from a class society to a risk society. And Loïc Leconte, who was a student of Bourdieu, writes about class in urban settings, particularly around so-called ghettos, and how there's levels of poverty and exclusion in those areas that kind of rival the so-called developing world, but are in the so-called developed world. And Leconte points out the injustices and exploitation that are going on related to those forms of exclusion, particularly around race and racial violence that's directed towards those marginalised people by the police and other governmental policies and institutions. Michel Agier talks about what he calls managing the undesirables. Again, relating back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of boat people. Here, the kind of developments of globalisation and climate change and wars are seeing more people pushed out of where they are born or where they're living, particularly around the refugees. And this movement has been something that's becoming increasingly undesired by people in wealthy countries, and much politics becomes around this politics of fear of managing these so-called undesirables. Agier is asking us there to think about class in a much different manner here that kind of relates to issues of mobility and who gets to be pushed and pulled around the world. Guy Standing talks about the precariat. He argues there's a new global class that's kind of, somewhat like the previous working class, but it's those that are kind of stuck in insecure work all around the world, that global changes, particularly the way that companies can move around, can see people made redundant, can see challenges to labour market laws and the rules and rights that workers have increasingly challenged. This is leaving more and more people in a precarious position. For Standing, he argues that there's a possibility that those in the precariat could kind of recognise each other and develop a class consciousness to do something about it. At the moment, that's not really happening, but again, Standing, like Marx, has some kind of positive things to say about the possibilities of what's at the moment really uncertain and precarious labour markets. Now, I mentioned there, throughout, that there's kind of, in the production-consumption relations, there's many kind of radical critiques of these system argues that there's still the equivalence of slavery going on around the world in terms of, who's making our stuff and who benefits from that situation. So again, I've got a little link there if you want to check that out, where there's a little survey that you can do about, the way that you live, and it estimates how many slaves that have probably, been working for you in that sense. Even though you're not paying them directly, there's people in this system that are being treated like slaves, and our consumption practices are the things that drive those things. So if you want to have a look at that, please do. Okay, so throughout to conclude, basically I've gone through the ideas of what wealth and inequality is, how class itself is a systematic way of thinking about those things, outlined Marx and Weber and Bourdieu as kind of key thinkers about class, and in the last section looked at kind of more contemporary understandings of that stuff. Class is the thing that I'm most interested in as a sociologist, and I've mostly done research using a Bourdieusian perspective. So again, if you're interested in that kind of stuff as well, please check out the links to my work on my website and on the website for the book. Okay, thanks.